Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm Bill Zangeneh-Lester. I'm the Department Chair for Humanities and Religious Studies at American River College. And I'm going to begin by reading our ARC land statement. So we acknowledge the land which we occupy at American River College as the traditional home of the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok tribal nations. These sovereign people have been caretakers of this land since time immemorial. Despite centuries of genocide and occupation, the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok continue as vibrant and resilient tribes and bands, both federally recognized and unrecognized. We take this opportunity to acknowledge the generations that have come before us, as well as the present-day Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok people. So we're joined today by my co-host and three distinguished guests who will introduce themselves, starting with V.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Gray, but if you've met me, I'm V. I'm an adjunct professor. I teach humanities and religious studies at, right now, ARC and FLC, and I'm incredibly excited for this conversation.
And Amir.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amir Hussain. I use he, him pronouns, and I teach at Loyola Marymount University, which is the Jesuit university down here south of you in Los Angeles. I'm in the Department of Theological Studies, and I teach about Islam and Muslims.
And Gil.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Gil Klein. My pronouns are he, him, and I teach. I'm a colleague of Amir's and previously a colleague of Najwa. I am also teaching at the Department of Theological Studies at LMU.
And Najwa.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Bill and V, for organizing this panel. My name is Najwa al-Qattan. I am Emerita Professor of Ottoman and Middle Eastern History at Loyola Marymount University.
Thank you all so much for joining us and having this timely and important conversation today. I want to give us a little context, our audience, a little context for this talk today. So American River College is one of 116 California community colleges, which itself is the largest system of higher education in the country. In 2019, about 69% of our 2.1 million students were students of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. So the data is pretty clear. We're the most diverse institutions of higher education in California. But we also see these similar trends nationally. Depending on the year, community colleges educate more than half of all undergraduates in the United States. In 2020, over half of all of those students, about 55%, were students of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. Now, in the Los Rios Community College District, we likely know that community colleges are overwhelmingly the most diverse institutions in higher education. But what is less known is what Diana Eck's Pluralism Project at Harvard demonstrates, which is that there are correlations between ethnic and cultural diversity and religious diversity. What this means is that community colleges are likely the most religiously diverse institutions anywhere in higher education. For example, here at American River College in Sacramento, we have the largest Afghani refugee population in the country, many of whom are Shia Muslims. We have the largest Sikh population in the United States in nearby Yuba City, many of whom attend American River College. We have the second largest Hmong population, many of whom practice shamanism. We have the third largest Jain community. And we have the fourth largest Russian and Ukrainian populations, many of whom came to Sacramento fleeing religious persecution and include Orthodox, Protestant, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Yet, even though we're surrounded by religious diversity in Sacramento, and in California, we don't necessarily talk about religion on our public campuses. Now, although community colleges have embraced robust diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility initiatives, DEIA, there's little to no training on how religious diversity relates to DEIA for either faculty or administrators or students. So then we have this culture of widespread religious illiteracy, which serves as a systemic barrier to efforts to counter anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other related forms of discrimination, all of which have been escalating as a result of the ongoing crisis in Israel and Palestine, which brings us to today's event. So this semester, our department has been working to bridge these gaps with our Interfaith Literacy Professional Development Series, which has been holding space to connect our campus community to the latest scholarship and expertise to better navigate the impacts of the crisis in Israel and Palestine on our Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, Arab, and Palestinian staff and students. So today, we're going to shift our focus to the crisis in Israel and Palestine itself. And we're joined by Amir and Gil and Najwa. And I'm going to have about 2 questions for everyone, after which we'll have time for a Q&A with the audience. So if you're in the audience, you can be sending in questions via the chat, and V will be keeping track of everyone's questions. I know if we have time, we'll get to as many questions as possible. And this first question that I have is for Amir. So Amir, yeah, you recently served as the president of the American Academy of Religion. What is that? But more importantly, how did this experience serving in this position, how has it informed your understanding of the current crisis in Israel and Palestine?
Thanks for that, Bill. I really appreciate the question. But before I start, I want to echo the thanks to you, to everyone at American River College for the work that you're doing. You know, we teach here in Los Angeles, and Santa Monica College, I think, is our biggest community college that feeds both into the UC system and other places, including UCLA. And so that kind of work that you do is so important. So thank you, for that. As Bill, as you said, I served for 3 years on the executive board, last year as president, before that on the board of directors of the American Academy of Religion. So the American Academy of Religion is the world's largest scholarly organization for the study of religion. We have about 6,000 members who are academics. Some of them are graduate students, about a third are graduate students, about a third are contingent faculty. The sort of reality of academia, which I don't want to get into, is a lot more folks who are contingent, non-tenure track faculty, as opposed to people like me or Gil or Najwa, now that she's emerita, are all tenure track faculty. And so about a third graduate students, about a third contingent faculty, about a third tenure line faculty, all of whom study religion in different kinds of ways. So our mission statement is very simple. The American Academy of Religion's mission is to foster excellence in the academic study of religion and enhance the public understanding of religion. And so just about 10 years ago, when I was on the board of directors, we did work with the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations about religious literacy, meaning what is it that people should know, not about a particular religion, but about sort of religion, broadly speaking, as a phenomenon. You described, Bill, very eloquently, the diversity of your students, including ethnic diversity, religious diversity. That's writ large, in California. And so how do we understand this now? A couple of things. One is only about 20% of US universities have a religion department. I taught for 8 years at Cal State Northridge. Cal State Northridge had a religion department. A lot of that was doing work with our students in the School of Education, especially liberal studies, who wanted to go on and teach. And so in California, you have, my wife teaches fourth grade California missions. You deal with religion, like literally in elementary school in California. And so this task force with support from the Arthur Finding Davis Foundations was, what would we like people to know about religion, given 20% of colleges have religion departments, and most students will not take a religion class. What's the nursing student who's taking a 2-year nursing program? What she need to know about religion? And part of it was, the diversity. And this goes to your second question of what has this taught me about the crisis? I say all the time in my world religions class, if you're going to learn one thing in this class, there's no one way to be anything. A Muslim, what kind of Muslim? Sunni Muslim, Shia Muslim, a 12 or Shia, Nashri, Ismaili Muslim, progressive Muslim, liberal Muslim, conservative Muslim, Afghani Muslim, Pakistani Muslim, Karachi, Lahore, big city or small town, all those kinds of differences, and so how do you talk about the complexities of religion? How do you talk about the human element in this? And so last year I served as president of the AAR, and sometimes we are asked by our members to make statements. Now, we're very careful that, we support all sorts of noble causes. Our members support all sorts of noble causes, but we're really there for the academic study of religion, public understanding of religion. And so if you want us to make a statement, do we oppose hunger? Absolutely. Are we going to make a statement about hunger or the unhoused? No, because that's not our purview, even though many of our members, of course, work to help the unhoused and the hungry. And so we have a process by which people ask for requests for statements. We got a request for a statement, and we had to think about this. Are we going to issue a statement, given that we're this big tent of scholars, including folks who work very closely with Jewish texts, including folks who are Israeli, including folks who are Arab Palestinian, who are pro-Palestinian. So you literally have, very sincere folks who are on different sides of the issue. And that's the other thing I want to say, that just what I was saying about the religions is like, it's not just two sides. It's not the Israeli Palestinian side. It's like, what are the nuances on the Palestinian side? What are the nuances within the Israeli side? Where do American folks fit in on either one of those kinds of things there? And so how do you come up with a statement? Do you come up with a statement? And we said, yeah, we need to do this because you literally have, scholars of religion who are working on this. You literally have, scholars of religion who are involved in the violence, they're meaning victims, of that violence, and putting it in the context of the larger setting. And, how do you say, on the one hand, of course, we condemn the violence that happened on October 7th by Hamas. There's no justification for the murder of innocents. On the other hand, this statement came out, I think we put it out October 24th or so. So, maybe 3 weeks in, which took us a little bit of time. And we'd already seen the sort of, in response to the attacks by Hamas, the murders of Palestinian civilians. And so how do you balance those kinds of things and talk about that? You decry the taking of hostages, but then, as a good scholar, you have to talk about the occupation and what's happening there. And then not connecting, and I'll stop here, not connecting people with their governments, in the same way that many Americans may support or not support their government. Forget about federal government. Think about local government, like what's happening in the Sacramento area. Think about California government. Then think about the U.S. government. Like, are you in favor of what your government is doing in your name? You may not be. Same thing with Israel. And so how do you have that kind of complexity? And so we got a number of folks who were delighted that we put out the statement. We got a number of folks who said they're horrified and they're going to resign their membership because they don't feel safe about the statement. And we understood that's one of the things, when you put out a statement, you understand that some folks will react in this way, some folks react in other ways. The thing that bothered me, and I will stop here, is the folks who use this almost like a, how do I say it, a performative act. They didn't email me, they didn't email us. They sort of did this thing on Twitter of, look what's going on and we're going to resign. And I'm like, but you didn't say anything to us when we were doing this. You didn't talk to us. If you really wanted to engage, there's lots of ways to engage. This very much is something sort of performative, and unfortunately, one of the hard truths you learn about academics is there's some diva in some of us, and there's that performance, kind of thing there where you want to make the statement rather than actually sort of do the work sometimes. And I'm not decrying that, because sometimes you need to make the statement. But anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Yeah, that so many important points there, and thank you so much for kind of setting this foundation for the conversation. I will say that, as we've been having some of these workshops, it's been interesting to tell folks how much the academic study of religion has changed over time, especially in the last like 15 years. And in large part because of this Arthur Vining Davis and religious literacy, and kind of asking the question of what is most relevant about religious studies now, and how in the past, there has been an emphasis on ritual practices or what scriptures say, which doesn't necessarily prepare us to navigate, like what we're seeing today, the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that we're seeing today. But how much that has changed, and how simultaneously, because of these dynamics that you're talking about with like media and social media, cherry picking, ahistorically, out and acontextually, these very bombastic statements, rather than having some kind of meaningful conversation, just kind of bringing out the worst dimension of the diva in all of us, right? And that's precisely where I'm so grateful to be an educator, because we don't, our job is to be research informed. It is to have substantive conversations, historical, contextual conversations. And you've given us a lot of important context here. And I want to shift to Gil, and I'll just remind our audience, anything that Amir brought up that you want to ask about, we'll bring it up in the Q&A. But talking about having these more substantive conversations, Gil, how does your training as a scholar of religion inform your thinking about the current crisis in Israel and Palestine differently than what we're seeing in public discourse? What's public discourse leaving out? And as a scholar of religion, what do you wish more people, especially on college campuses, knew right now, and why?
Thank you for this question and for the opportunity really to be on this panel and talk with you, with my colleagues. I am in a very peculiar position in the field of the study of religion or religious history. Theology or theological studies is the way we call our department, but not all of us are theologians. And so religious studies in general is itself a very complex term. But I'm also personally on a position of marginality in a way in this field, as well as maybe in terms of my personal background. So I am born and raised in Israel, to a Jewish family, secular, left-leaning. I left Israel about 20-something years ago. And I got to the study of religion through the study of architecture. I'm a trained architect, and I did my PhD in the history and theory of architecture, and got interested in the political aspects of this question, and the political and the religious dimensions of the ancient world, how people come together as a city. We spoke a little bit about diversity earlier. Cities are really fostering diversity in a different way than anywhere else. And so I focused on the ancient world, but the study of sacred space and architecture was very much at the heart of, or is still very much at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, war, ongoing. So that is one aspect to which I arrive not as a Jew, not as an Israeli, not as an Israeli left-wing activist, working to end the occupation, not as an American Israeli or an American Jew. I come to it really as a historian of culture, maybe as an architect. And so that gives me advantages and disadvantages. I hope more advantages than disadvantages. And I do think of religion as a growing factor currently in various conflicts around the world, but specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Partly because of this issue of the sacred space, the significance of the land, the significance of the sacred sites, the various theologies that developed around this notion of sacred space. And so partly I'm also arriving this in the sense of becoming more and more curious about the politics of religion, and sensing that in the US there is some level of hesitancy when it comes to talking about religion. It's almost too private to share or to criticize or to become vocal about. And so one thing that I tell my students is that I encourage them to, and I think it's the right way of being an involved citizen, to consider religion and to consider it in the variety of political context. I can say more later about the specific religious dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I can talk more about the role of apocalypticism or messianism in this conflict. I can elaborate more on the specific role of sacred sites. But I think that there is a lot to learn, especially those of us who care and those of us who feel affected by the war. There's a lot to learn, and I think that is one of the most important things that I would hope for students on campuses, on American campuses today, to learn more about the religious background of the conflict, not because it's the only one or even the central one. It's one of many components, but it's there and it needs to be discussed. And again, from the perspective of Judaism as a scholar of ancient Judaism, it is also important to note that Judaism is not exactly like Christianity, Islam, or for that matter, any other religion, in the sense that it's not strictly a matter of faith or religious practice that you follow in the private realm. Judaism is complex because it doesn't fall into the familiar categories of religion versus nationality, or ethnicity versus religion. In Judaism, there is a long-standing history of tension between these categories, and the sense that they cannot be easily separated. And I think this is an important component here when we talk about anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism or anti-Jews. It's important to remember that this is not only, that Jews do not only respond to specific religious symbols, but that there is much more than that, at least in the psyche of Jews in the US. Israel might be something else. But so these are the things that I think are still missing in our discussions, that I would very much like to promote, the discussion of which I wish to promote. And I think I'll stop here because we'll have more to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, so much important context there. And I particularly appreciate bringing how complex the identity pieces are. It's actually one of the reasons I'm so grateful that we have this kind of multidisciplinary panel, because if we only apply, you know, a religious studies lens, for example, you end up missing pieces of the puzzle. So having multidisciplinary conversations, multi-faith conversations is when a more complete picture, when you can have a more serious conversation, we actually are talking about what we're talking about. I also love the various themes that you've kind of laid out that we can explore. Thank you. I'm intrigued and already thinking of several questions about apocalypticism, messianism, roles of sacred sites. So we'll definitely circle back to that and encourage the audience, if you're intrigued by that, think of some questions. But on the theme of multidisciplinarity, I would like to shift to Najwa. And Najwa, you're a historian. How does your training as a historian inform your thinking about the current crisis in Israel and Palestine differently than what we're seeing in public discourse? What's being left out in public discourse? And as a historian, what do you wish more people, especially on college campuses, knew right now, and why?
Thank you, Bill. And yes, I do approach this question as a historian, not as a professor of theological studies. So I would say that from my perspective, the two things that are generally missing from the public discourse are history and complexity. I believe that the only way to fully understand the current war in Gaza and the conflict as a whole, including what is going on in the West Bank, is historically. I think the historical perspective, first, provides the context for this war. Second, it helps in understanding the conduct of the war. And third, it adds much needed complexity, particularly regarding the question of the role of religion in this conflict. So first, let's look at the context. A historical approach would reveal that the conflict did not start on October 7, 2023. The conflict is over 100 years old and started with the emergence of the Zionist movement, which is European, secular, Jewish nationalist movement, and the immigration of tens of thousands of European Jews to Palestine, which at that time was a predominantly Arab, Palestinian, Muslim peasant society, and their successful project of settling the land, evicting its people, and establishing the State of Israel in 1948. Hence, 1948 witnessed success for the Zionist movement with the establishment of the State of Israel, but at the same time, for the Palestinians, who call it the Nakba, or the catastrophe, it was a different story altogether. In a nutshell, what history reveals, I believe, is that there is a long and complicated context that is still playing out today, including the consequences of Israel's successful displacement or ethnic cleansing of 80% of the indigenous population of Palestine in 1948, and the foreclosure on any hopes for Palestinian self-determination. In fact, I would insist that the histories of the Palestinian and Israeli people are intertwined and impossible to understand one without the other. Second, I would argue that in addition to revealing the context for this war, history might help us in understanding the conduct of Israel's total war in Gaza, the forceful removal of civilians, the use of 2,000-pound bombs against them, even in Israeli designated safe areas, the systematic withholding of clean water, food, medication, and electricity, the destruction of Gaza schools, universities, hospitals, and most homes. It is difficult not to see these actions as anything other than the continuation of the events of 1948 and as taking the aims of the Zionist movement to their logical and historical and tragic conclusions. Third, a historical look at the conflict adds complexity in a crucial way, as I mentioned. It addresses the question of religion and its role in this conflict. So let me start off by saying a few things about history and religion, actually just 2 points. Again, from the perspective of the discipline of history. First, historically, religious differences alone were not enough in most times to trigger the kind of sectarian violence that litters the historical past in most spaces of the globe. More often than not, religious intolerance became communal violence in times of economic crisis, epidemics, holidays such as Easter, which was a prime time for accusations of blood libel against Jewish communities in Europe, for example. And most importantly, when religion was or is put at the service of nationalism and nationalist movements, which is what I think is going on in Israel, Palestine today. Second, we in this country tend to resist the idea that a national movement can be religious and nationalist at the same time, particularly when it comes to organizations like Hamas or even Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hamas is indeed an Islamist organization and was born out of the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Still, its focus is only on Palestinian territory, and it has never concerned itself with the plight of other Muslim communities around the world. At the same time, I would guess that Hamas would have waged war against Israel, even if Israel had been Christian or Buddhist for that matter, and vice versa. It might be tempting to assume that the conflict is a religious conflict, and here I will conclude with how history reveals the complexity and not just the context and the conduct of the war. Because I do realize that it is tempting, as I said, to focus on the religious identities of the two sides and assume that it is mostly about religion. But I think that that approach would be simplistic and reductionist and assume that religious difference explains everything. So let's complicate it. Even though both Islamic and Jewish religious symbols and language have sometimes been marshaled by some groups among both Palestinians and Israelis, and have in the process added, in my opinion, deadly ammunition to the conflict is not about religion, but is a territorial conflict over a small area of the world that both Israelis and Palestinians insist is their ancestral and historical home and to which they have exclusive claim. This claim, based on a historical connection between a group and a territory, is nationalism. But to say that the conflict is not about religion is not the same thing as saying that religion does not play a part. One striking example is the way in which the early Zionist movement, secular by self-definition and opposed to the pacifism of religious Jews, nonetheless made the return of the Jews to Palestine or to the land of Israel as the only way to secure a Jewish state. Other options, such as Uganda or upstate New York, simply did not appeal to Zionist leaders, nor did it resonate with Jewish historical memory. And finally, as Gil also mentioned, and needless to say, the fact that the tiny territory in question is not just Palestine or the land of Israel, but is the Holy Land for millions of Jews, Christians, and Muslims around the globe, adds complications and interest, of course, to this conflict, as you might imagine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Some very important context there. I particularly appreciate this continuing to push us towards thinking in terms of our complexities, that if this somehow the conflict is reduced to being a conflict between religions, then so much important context is being left out. we can see the way that we talk a lot about how religion can be appropriated in conversations about power in some of the workshops that we've been doing this semester. And so, for example, we looked at Robert Pape, who's professor at University of Chicago, wrote this book, gosh, 10 years ago, I guess now, Cutting the Fuse, where they're looking at what are some of the sources of suicide terrorism, and whether or not there was correlations between suicide terrorism and religious belonging, because of the Islamophobic stereotype, for example, of Islam being attached to violence. And of course, when they did this study, they found out that there's no correlation between concentrations of religious populations and acts of suicide terrorism. And in fact, they found that there wasn't even not only was there not a correlation between a particular religion, but there wasn't a correlation between religious identity at all, because there were Marxist group, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, were statistically as likely to carry out a suicide bombing as someone who identified with a religion. So the point being that the media was presenting it as though it was about religion. In reality, it was not. And what they found out, that there was a factor which motivated suicide bombings that cut through religious identities, which was foreign occupation. What Pape's study found was that wherever there was foreign occupation is where you would find statistically more likely that suicide bombings would be carried out. And yet, that's not how it was presented on the media. It was like such and such identity commits a suicide terrorism act, without looking at these deeper political and historical conflicts that you've kind of laid out for us here. So thank you so much for that. And I want to invite our audience to lean into this complexity, and which are the pieces of the complexity that you are wrestling with, and when is religion implicated in it, but when does religion serve to conceal the kinds of other things that are happening, as Najwa has been explaining with us. So on the note of complexity, I want to shift to Amir. And for a lot of folks who are trying to work out the calculus of their relationship to everything that's happening right now, in terms of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, I wanted to ask you about how you work out some of the identities that you hold as part of your scholarship. So let me just ask you, how does your scholarship inform your identity? How does your identity inform your scholarship? And how does these various tensions empower you to think differently about the current crisis in Israel and Palestine than what we're seeing in public discourse?
Thank you for that, Bill. So I don't want to be autobiographical in the sense of wanting to talk about myself, but just as a way of giving some context here. So I was born in Pakistan. I grew up in Canada. So I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Toronto, in a time in which Toronto was this, provincial British Protestant city. The Italian Catholic was the exotic other. Forget about the Muslim. By the time I left Toronto in 1997, after literally kindergarten to PhD, it was the most cosmopolitan city in North America. Huge sort of changes. But my experience as a Muslim, so I'm someone who was born into a Muslim family, grew up Muslim, was informed by being in a minority setting. Then you go and do an undergraduate degree in psychology, switch to religion, did a master's and a PhD in the study of religion, looking at Muslim communities in Toronto. Came out to the US and got hired at Cal State Northridge. So I taught at CSUN for 8 years. So I have great love for the CSU system. And I'm perfectly happy, on record here being filmed to say there's no better university education for the money than the Cal State University system. I think we give a better education. We're also charging 6 times the tuition at the Cal States, and so that there's that part. So not to get into that conversation, but teaching in the Cal States for 8 years, and then coming into a Catholic Jesuit university, and at first thinking, wait, I'm not even a Christian. Forget about being a Catholic. Why would I be in a Jesuit Catholic school and a theology department. And 20 years later, I can't imagine a better place to be. And so all this by way of weaving in parts of my identity. I'm a Muslim, but I'm a Muslim who's grown up in a minority setting. I grew up in Canada. I've lived now for almost, it's a funny moment, you're coming up on exactly almost the same time that I've lived in the US as I lived in Canada. Where I'm going with that, and hopefully it's obvious for folks, is the political situation is quite different. The relationship between the US and Israel is a very different relationship than the relationship between Canada and Israel. The sort of support that the US government gives is greater than any other government, for what happens in Israel. And so the political kinds of things get woven up in that. Me being a Muslim is a Muslim in a minority context, not in a majority context. It's me as a Muslim growing up with Jewish friends. It's growing up with Jewish teachers. I think about doing my PhD in the study of Islam, and I had 4 really amazing people, including 2 of the best people in the world for what I did. My mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the great scholar of religion, Protestant Christian. Another person on my committee, Jane McAuliffe, one of the best scholars of the Quran, Catholic woman. None of the people on that committee were Muslim. So you have this really interesting kind of thing happening there. And so learning about your tradition, understanding that tradition, for me, part of it was, and this happened really as an undergraduate student. One of the people that Gil knows well, one of my mentors is Peter Richardson, this amazing sort of scholar of New Testament, like Gil, also a trained architect, did a magnificent book on King Herod, a magnificent book on Herod's architecture. Herod was one of the great builders in the East, And so we went on a trip in 1988. That was my first time going to Israel, Palestine. In 1988, we were able to go into Gaza, And so seeing things on the ground and being able to sort of look at things. And again, that's as a scholar, it's one thing to talk about a particular place. It's another thing, well, have you been there? Have you talked to the people there? The next time I was there was with Gil, and Gil may talk about that as well. In 2012, we took students there at LMU, through our Center for Service and Action, looking at, okay, what is it that Israelis and Palestinians are doing on the ground about peace? We were very, I don't want to put words in Gil's mouth, so let me just say instead of I was very reluctant about any kind of official peace happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is 2012, but Israelis and Palestinians have to live together. How are they living together? What are they doing? What are the organizations on the ground that are trying to work? Because people are in each other's lives. Neither group is going anywhere. What do you do? How do you understand this? So we did this in 2012. And the last time I was there was 2019 with our campus ministry, doing this wonderful sort of interfaith pilgrimage, the first interfaith pilgrimage trip to Israel, Palestine that campus ministry had done. And it's straight out of any kind of joke you want. A Muslim, a Rabbi Zach Zeisman, and a Catholic priest, take Muslim, Christian, and Jewish students to Israel and Palestine, but showing them the places and showing them the different kinds of places, showing them the complexity. So I think in answer to your question about the scholar of religion part informing the faith, it's seeing the much bigger picture, because you have your own understanding of what it means to be a Muslim, in my case in the minority, in my case someone who's working class origins and background. How do you see the bigger picture of that? What are the things at play? And then I'll stop here. The great thing about being in a university setting is the conversations with colleagues like Najwa, who's a historian, trained as a historian, with colleagues in art history who know something about, art of the Islamic world, with colleagues in the philosophy department, who have training in Islamic philosophy, with colleagues in the political science department who have expertise in the politics of the Middle East. And I think that's really, for me, the strength of whether we're talking about the four-year university like we have, or the community college system where you're at, you have these departments. You have people who are trained in history. You have people who are trained in political science. You have people who are trained in religion. How do you come? I'm just using those 3 examples. How do you then come together? How do you work together? How do you take that expertise? Oh, Najwa, tell me about this, because you're an expert in the history of the Ottoman Empire, and this part of the world used to be part, of that empire. So the historical sort of context. Gil, as a scholar of Judaism as someone whose first degree was in architecture, who comes at it from a very different kind of understanding. Me as someone who's not a Palestinian, is not an Arab, but understands something about Islam in America and the ways in which this connects with American Muslims, but also, and this is the religion part there, we sort of frame the narrative of Palestinians as Muslim, even though 15% of Palestinians are Christian, and historically some really important Palestinian Christian communities. And so, you think of, the 1,001 reasons why what's happened in Gaza is so horrific. But, on that list is one of the, Gil, you may even know, third, fourth, fifth oldest church is St. Porphyry's Church, there. So that, you have this happening. Like, wait, one of the oldest Christian churches is in Gaza? There are Christians in Gaza who've been Christians for 2,000 years. Those kinds of connections I think are so important. So I hope that answers the question there.
Thank you so much, Amir. Absolutely. So when religious phenomenon are reported so simplistically in the media, I think that there's a way that the public can think simplistically about it, and that's kind of part of the problem that we're seeing so much, especially when it comes around and understanding complexity in Israel and Palestine. As we've heard, this can't be reduced to like conflict between Jews and Muslims, and this, it's interesting. This dynamic, I think, can be internalized by a lot of this kind of simplistic dynamic can be internalized by students. This happens a lot in my religious studies classes, where someone will say, well, for example, I was showing a documentary one time, and one of my students had his kind of eyes averted from the documentary the entire time. So I asked him to step outside, and I said, are you okay? Is everything all right? And he's like, yeah, I just can't watch this documentary. And I said, well, why not? And he said, listen, like, would you gaze upon someone else's spouse? And I said, well, I don't understand the relevance of that. And he said, well, listen, I would not. And so for me to see a documentary about a different religion is like, looking on someone else's spouse. I don't want to do it. And so I asked him, I was like, well, what made you want to take the class? And he said, my pastor invited me to want to see the class. I was like, well, then can you have the DVD? This was back when we had DVDs. Can you take the DVD back and watch it with your pastor? And he said, yes. But the point here is that I think a lot of people, if they aren't connected to any particular faith community, or even if they are, would be surprised to hear your story, Amir, that here you are, a Muslim scholar, who is reading books written by Catholics, right, about Islam, and having all these that developing this identity is anything but simple. It's complex, it's interwoven. There are so many dynamics that are going in here. And I just don't know that students are used to thinking about that. I also don't know that the public is used to thinking about that. So this is really helpful to hear this about your journey, because I think it gives permission for people to start thinking as these dynamics is much more complex. Because I think the narrative has been that it's simple, and that all Jews agree about this and all Muslims agree about that, and that these are just these big monoliths like juggernauts through history, and it's just ahistorical. So I want to, on the same thread, I want to shift to Gil. And Gil, you have already spoken to us about, navigating some complexity. So how does your scholarship inform the various identities that you shared with us? And then how do those identities inform your scholarship? And how do both challenge and empower, right? Either complicate or open up new doors, the way that you think differently about the crisis in Israel and Palestine than what we're seeing in public discourse?
Thank you. So I think that one of the advantages of coming to the study of ancient Judaism, and in fact, the broader period of late antiquity, which is when Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism, and early Islam begin to develop and understand themselves, really coming from more or less the same place, more or less the same time. And so, as a scholar of that period and that place, I have this, I think, knowledge of the history, but the long history. Najwa was mentioning the importance of the context, and this context goes back a long time, not specifically the conflict that we see today, but a lot of the ways in which these three religions in particular shaped themselves and their self-understanding and the world around them starts already at the very beginning. So that gives me, I think, a perspective that is important and can teach us a lot. The fact that I'm not a member of any Jewish congregation, I'm not a practicing Jew, gives me a distance from these materials. And so I look at it from the outside, but also with some affinity with the language, with the knowledge of the place, the places that are mentioned in all of these texts. So in this way, and I think this is something that I encourage in my students, the act of becoming a scholar or of teaching yourself is not simply gathering information, but rather putting a stake in the material, putting yourself in there, not floating above the fry, so to say. You become part of it once you immerse yourself in this material. And so, and if you do it right, then the complexity will come on its own because the history is complex. It doesn't mean that there are no aggressors or victims. It doesn't mean that everybody's right. It doesn't mean that everybody needs to hold hands because we all worship the same God and so on. That's not helpful, right? We do need to look at the difficult parts. We do need to look them in the eyes, even when it's not comfortable for us. And I must say that I have been uncomfortable since childhood, specifically because the Palestinian issue. I've been feeling an outsider in my own community because I couldn't understand how this can be accepted. And so it's not because I was practicing Judaism, or in spite of the fact that I was not practicing Judaism, it gave me a certain understanding of the world context in which this is happening. And so I think in terms of faith, again, faith is a very specific term that might not necessarily apply to Judaism. Judaism does not require faith, it requires action. And so there's no ideology or faith statement that you can say and you're in. That's not how it works. So it's about hard work. It's about hard work of understanding this. And when you do the hard work, you discover beautiful, beautiful, beautiful texts and works of art in early Christianity, in early Rabbinic Judaism, in early Islam, that were full of the kind of love of peace that we crave for, or at least I crave for over there. So there are these materials, and it's full of both evil and beauty and goodness and love. And it's the way in which these symbols, these principles, these theologies have been mobilized that really makes them tools or elements in this violent conflict. And so I think that one of the issues that helps me through my scholarship is the sacred space that I mentioned. again, it's maybe a point that was somehow touched on by Amir as well, but the fact that there are places there in Palestine, in Israel, that are loved and worshipped and are held so dear to different communities that are sometimes joining together in sharing these places. There is one specific church, for example, St. George, which has it's basically part of the local Christian community in Palestine. But it has also been a place for Muslims to visit. And so the blessing that comes with this place, the place that promises something, regardless of the religion, functions with or without faith statements, with or without practices. And you see two communities that are often not getting along, and this also applies to Jews in the area, but coming together because the place is capable of giving them something that they need. And so some places like the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, is another complicated site that you can see as the core of a lot of the conflicts, especially around Jerusalem. But it's also a place that's held sacred by both Islam and Judaism, or by both Jews and Muslims. And so there have been, at least in the world of scholarship, in this maybe bubble of idealism, we find ourselves with colleagues studying the history of Islam, colleagues studying the history of Christianity, geeking out together about the Temple Mount, because we bring with our own materials so much love and care for these places. And so maybe for now, it can only happen in academia. Even this is beginning to fracture. And this is maybe something that's related to the, what happens on campuses in the US. But there is a place where people do not give up their identity, but they come with their religious background and they interact with one another. That doesn't mean that they're the same. It doesn't mean that they share values, but there are places in which they can meet. And I think throughout the history of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, at least since 48, there have been crossroads where peace could have emerged. It, begrudgingly on both sides, but it could have happened. And there were very specific attempts, nationalistic attempts, religious nationalistic attempts to destroy these opportunities. So again, we can talk more if there are specific questions about campuses, because I think it's a really pressing issue. But I think in terms of your question, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. For deepening this understanding of the complexities, and I hope, as our audience is listening, they're hearing how there's so many different ways to enter into these topics, and whatever, not to generalize about one particular community or assume that one particular community orients to the conflict in Israel and Palestine in a particular way, or understands themselves in relationship to those things in any particular way. Again, lots more trailheads that we can follow that you've laid out for us, including and especially about how these conversations are taking place on campuses. Like what are some of the responses that we're seeing, and how there's really such a lack of the, you said we were only having this discourse in academia, right? But even that's fracturing, right? How much of a disconnect there is between how these conversations can take place in a space like this versus how they're taking place on social media and the news. And it's hard to imagine that these places exist in the same planet, right? A scholarly space and a social media space. And so I thank you for drawing that. That's actually, part of the point of today is to see that, because academia, and especially this can come up in the community college context, can be seen as, somehow irrelevant or out of touch or out of connection or something like that. When quite the opposite, I would say that, it's in conversations like these where we can see how to understand, something complex like the crisis in Israel and Palestine. This is where that understanding can happen. And it takes a certain amount of critical discourse, and it takes work and patience, but it's also how you get real results. So thank you so much for continuing us down that path. And I want to shift to Najwa. And Najwa, you gave us so much important historical context in your last question, and I see a lot of questions in the chat about some of the issues you raised. But I want to ask you this. So Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, they've been around for a long time. I'm curious about how the historical legacies of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are impacting public discourse about the crisis in Israel and Palestine. There's a lot of folks who maybe don't have context for this, who think that anti-Semitism didn't exist before the crisis in Israel and Palestine. They didn't think that Islamophobia existed before. I mean, this is all new to them. So how does your training as a historian empower you to recognize these dynamics? And what advice can you give us who wish to learn to be able to do the same?
Thank you. I do wish to answer this question about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism again as a historian, but I realized as I'm listening to some of the autobiographical aspects of Gil and Amir's discussions is that perhaps it might be worthwhile to share one incident that happened to me. I think many in the audience have already guessed that I am Palestinian, which I am, Palestinian American. I grew up in a very secular Muslim household, so like no real religious elements there, but certainly part of the culture. I also grew up in Lebanon, where religious identity is made clear to you very early in life. And I went to actually a Christian school because it was a good school, and I ended up learning a lot about the Bible. For me, both as an individual and as a scholar, I have actually rarely encountered Islamophobia. But I did have an encounter, interestingly, with anti-Semitism, a very awful experience that now, almost 30 years later, makes me still shake. It happened in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is important in the sense that it's supposed to be such a liberal place. In a grocery store where I was shopping for dinner with my young boy, when a man behind me took my place in the line and then proceeded to remove my food with the utmost disgust. And when I asked him what he was doing, he whispered something horrible about me being a Jewish woman. And when I asked him, "Excuse me," he said to me, "You know who you are, you know what I'm saying," and said it out loud. I was very, very shaken and was shocked that the people behind me pretended they did not hear anything, and that when the manager of the store was called in, as the guy was walking out, the first question she asked me, "Are you Jewish?" And the last thing that had occurred to me as he was just raining all these horrible anti-Semitic epithets at me is how dehumanized I felt, not that I wasn't Jewish. So for me, sharing this experience is really about telling students and others that anti-Semitism, like all phobias, all forms of racism, whether against religious, ethnic, or sexual identity, all dehumanize and are not only the problem of those who are their victim. So that's my story and my advice. But concerning Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, again, since this is a scholarly panel, and I'm a historian, I do want to approach it as such. Although, of course, at the end, we'll talk about current events. So yes, they're both old. And I think it's instructive to very briefly compare the two. First, I would say that Islamophobia is generally about religion, but it also casts Muslims as the other and racializes them regardless of the fact that the global Muslim population cuts across many ethnic groups. It has also fed on and fed into Orientalist attitudes about the East, that it is other than the West, that it's primitive and uncivilized, and these characteristics, of course, have been transposed onto Islam. In the case of anti-Semitism, a distinction must be made between pre-modern Christian anti-Semitism and modern anti-Semitism, which is based on race and which emerged in the 19th century. So while Christian anti-Semitism was rooted in the belief that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ, modern anti-Semites believe that the Jews are a race. Now, I also agree with Gil about this being not a clear-cut line, but in terms of the evolution of anti-Semitism, at least in Europe, this is what I believe I see. The second thing about comparing Islamophobia with anti-Semitism is that they operate in the same way, through essentializing identity, reducing it to a number of attributes such as violence, primitiveness, avarice. You can fill in the details. Third, I would hazard a guess that most Islamophobes are also anti-Semites. Perhaps the greatest historical example of this are the Crusades, which ultimately targeted Muslims, but nonetheless comprised attacks on Jewish communities on the way to the Holy Land in Europe and in the Holy Land upon arrival. Ironically, and I should mention this again as a historian, the Crusades themselves have left, as you might imagine, a long and dark historical shadow on the Middle East, with the West being associated since that time with invasion and violence. And of course, that was replicated with colonialism and imperialism in the modern period. And this has led some observers to compare the modern state of Israel to the medieval crusaders. Finally, in terms of the comparison, I would say that the emergence of Islam marked the rise of large and powerful empires, first under the Arabs in the 7th century, and later under the Ottoman Turks in the 13th century. These empires presented serious political and military threats to European empires, including the destruction of the Byzantine Empire and the capture of the city of Constantinople by Mehmed the Conqueror, an Ottoman Turk, in 1453. Because of this, Islamophobia is also rooted in historical fear of Muslim political and military power in ways that are not true of anti-Semitism. But how do these attitudes impact perspectives on the war today? Certainly from the beginning, the attack by Hamas on October 7 was described as an anti-Semitic crime and called the worst Jewish tragedy since the Holocaust. So at this point here, maybe this is a good place to stop and say that I, as a Palestinian, but also as a scholar, condemn what Hamas did on October 7th, and that the brutalization, kidnapping, and murder of Israeli civilians was reprehensible. But I really don't think that it was driven by anti-Semitism. For me, the most difficult question in this respect has been navigating the rather huge barrage of accusations of anti-Semitism in the discourse about the war in this country and the attempts to scare people and silence them about it. even though I must admit that there are groups of people who might be pro-Palestinian out of anti-Semitic sentiment or pro-Israel because of their Islamophobia. So this is what I would suggest that college students and the general public consider in thinking about the war at hand, considering again the question of whether anti-Semitism is the primary mover behind standing against the war in Gaza. First, I don't think it's difficult to distinguish between sentiments based on individuals or states or who they are versus what they do. So to hate the state of Israel no matter what, and to wish it evil because you hate the Jewish people is most definitely anti-Semitic. But to oppose the politics of the state of Israel is not. Or put simplistically, do you not oppose, or do not most of us oppose the Russia's war against Ukraine? Why does that not make us racists? So what I would say is that if you oppose Israel because of its genocidal actions in Gaza, you are brave, and you will find that thousands of Jews here and abroad agree with you. Some of the groups like Jewish Voice for Peace have been out there from the beginning acting against the war. Second, I think it is important to remember that the huge wave of pro-Palestinian support in this country and around the world was and continues to be very much motivated by people's sense of humanity and compassion and justice, and not just for the Palestinians, but for the persecuted communities everywhere. So how can it be anti-Semitic to wish an end to the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and an end to injustice everywhere? Third, the fact that Israel insists on calling itself the Jewish state does not mean that every attack against it is motivated by hatred for Jews. In fact, it should give us pause. It certainly give me a pause to actually stop and think about the name, the Jewish state, and to wonder how a state that understands citizenship as a function of religious identity and excludes non-Jews from it can at the same time call itself a democratic state and then use the race card to deflect criticism. In 2019, for example, the basic law of the State of Israel, its constitution, so to speak, was amended. Article 1 of the basic law declares that only the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in the State of Israel. This, by the way, excludes some 20% of the population, the descendants of the Palestinians who stayed in Israel after 1948. But beyond this, imagine if the United States, the Constitution in the United States were to be amended to exclude from citizenship everyone who was not Christian or not white. So while it is true that Israel is by no means the only deeply discriminating state, it is about the only one that claims to be a free and democratic country, even as its leaders have already described Gazans as vermin that should be exterminated or be forcibly removed. It is also a state that is supported in every way possible by the United States, I suppose until yesterday, and as such, indirectly, by every tax-paying citizen in this country. So that, in a sense, makes us complicit in the crimes that Israel is committing. So in conclusion, this is what I would ask of college students. Number one, please learn history. Number two, be careful about the words and the names that you use. Do not conflate Palestinians with Muslims or Israelis with Jews. And number three, remain vigilant in working for a better world and standing up for social justice and compassion everywhere, including, of course, at home. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So lots of additional context there, and encourage our audience, if there's something you would like to hear more about. We have now entered into the next part of this conversation. We've got about 30 minutes to go over some questions, a little bit less, 25. And so please submit some questions in the chat, and we'll ask our panelists and have a conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. There's so much to explore here, so I'm really excited. And I would like to start with this one. Okay, it looks like this first question I want to ask is asking about, the future of Israel and Palestine. So this one says, oops, shrunk it down by accident. What are, what would be necessary for building viable peace building efforts in Israel and Palestine? What is going to be, how is that process even going to be possible in light of everything that's been happening? This question also asks about a book called The West Bank. So I don't know if anyone's heard of that. And so, yeah, a question generally about, what's going to need to happen to move forward here. I'll just add, as you're thinking about that, as you're formulating an answer, that I was just listening to Rabbi Sharon Brous in Los Angeles, and on the issue of, what is it going to look like moving forward. And she said, something like, you can't plead for the humanity of one people while simultaneously dehumanizing another people. And you cannot dismiss an entire movement because of the worst elements of that movement. And at the same time, any movements that normalize anti-Semitism or Islamophobia will never lead to justice. And any movement that justifies or glorifies violence against civilians is not one that will lead to peace. And a movement that perpetuates denialism, where the sides are denying the facts on the ground for other people, will also never lead to justice. So this is Rabbi Sharon Brous. So what does it look like to have a movement that, calls for the humanity of all of these different pieces, all these sides? How do we have a piece that isn't dehumanizing?
Let me jump in if I could quickly, Bill, on this. I put this in the chat, and you can see the smile on my face. Sharon's my rabbi, so as a good Muslim, the one shul that I go to is Ikar, which is essence of Sharon and Melissa Balaban, who co-founded it. I've been friends with them for more than a decade. We had Melissa, who is the executive director of Ikar, come speak at one of our interfaith events. Which is really powerful. Because you need to have those voices. And so what I put in the chat was a op-ed that I did with a campus rabbi, where we quoted something that Sharon had said. And this is, extraordinary, because this is October 9th. And this is a rabbi who's studied in Israel and done really great work. I remember, it's all the kind of stereotypes that people have about religion. Someone was talking to Sharon once and said, like, well, your knowledge of Judaism and your Hebrew is really good. And she's like, I've lived in it. It's like, I'm a rabbi, right? Like, like this is not something I picked up for, a semester in college, kind of thing there. But that moment of, holding the humanity of the Jewish people alongside them. I'm quoting here, what I'm asking is for us to dare to hold the humanity, the heartache, the need for security of the Jewish people, while also holding the humanity, the dignity, need for justice of the Palestinian people. For too long, these have been set up as a false binary. In fact, the only liberation will be a shared liberation. The only justice is justice for all. So I think, to your point, I think it's those groups that are saying, yeah, how do we work towards these as a both and? not as an either or, not that it's about safety, security for the Palestinians. You know, as someone who's been in Israel a number of times, I've written about this, that, yeah, are you worried about, you know, being attacked in this kind of way or that kind of way by this group or that group? Sure. Neither one of those is helpful to me. You know, neither one of those is something that I want there. So how do you have safety and security for Israelis, safety and security for Palestinians? I think, you know, when we were there in 2012 with Gil, and Gil, maybe you want to chime in on this, a number of different groups that are doing that really important work on the ground. The group that was mentioned in the chat, Roots, I don't know Roots, but, you know, a lot of things we took students, Gil, I remember to meet with Rabbis for Human Rights. They took us into some of the places there. You have those kinds of things. So I think that's the key is, you know, who are the groups that are doing this kind of work?
Yeah, thank you, Amir. We had the three of us, Najwa, Amir, and myself, had a panel a few months ago at LMU, and I was at a point where right after October 7th and the aftermath, I was so deeply shaken, like many others, by the violence. It was hard to function truly, and for some people this continues. So out of this, I came with this wish to share the kind of peace activism that I'm familiar with in Israel, Palestine, with both Jews and Arabs working together for justice there, for the end of the occupation, for a solution for both nations. And the more I spoke about it and the more I think about this presentation back then, there were quite a few organizations, and there are more that I haven't mentioned, but it suddenly becomes a faraway dream that is becoming less and less realistic, in my view. I think that although there's a long and painful history between these nations, this is a turning point in terms of the intensity of the violence executed on both sides. And I think that there is something else that needs to happen, possibly pressure from the outside. I do want to say that although I completely support any demonstration these days to end the war in Gaza, to stop the attacks by Israel, I'm horrified by the situation there. I'm also deeply aware of the trauma that October 7th has caused in the Israeli psyche. And so it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult to convince Israelis that there could be peace with groups like the Hamas, for example. Unfortunately, the groups who instigated within Israel, the Jewish groups that instigated a lot of the attack on Palestinians by settlers on their neighbors, independently of the army, sometimes with the help or at least with a blind eye turned to their actions by the army. The group that is mostly responsible for the insertion of religion into this, the group of settlers, religious Zionism, as it's sometimes called, right-wing nationalistic religious groups are now extremely powerful. They're part of the coalition. They keep Netanyahu safe from prosecution on criminal charges. They have been working diligently for years and years and years to convince the Israeli or Jews in Israel at least, that they are surrounded by enemies and they have to strike first. They have convinced the Israelis that this land belongs to them and to no other. And they're motivated partly by these messianic hopes that I mentioned earlier, that by acting to bring the Messiah, you will actually participate in God's decision making and convince him to hasten redemption. And so there are many elements in this group that were very marginal in Jewish society, even 20, 30 years ago. Not that the occupation needed them necessarily, but they have made this much more severe in terms of the depth of the transformation of Israeli Jewish society. And so they have achieved what they were after. For them, the dream is that the Palestinians would suddenly disappear. Now they're even saying maybe by force, because this is what happens if they're there. And many Israelis who in the past would object to these kind of descriptions of reality and would object to the religious messages that they have about redemption, are now finding themselves convinced by these arguments. The Hamas has not made it easier for Palestinians by no means. The Hamas has not endangered Israel to the point where it will collapse. The demonstrations in the US will not cause Israel to collapse, and nor should they. In my view, Israel cannot be exterminated in the same way that the Palestinians cannot be exterminated. And so these two groups will eventually either have to experience the conflict becoming worse and worse and more violent, or they will have to stop. And so it's your guess is as good as mine at this point. At this point, I'm not very optimistic about peace activism. I'm disillusioned by peace activism, although I dedicated a lot of effort and time to pursuing it. I would say, however, that if the demonstrators who are pro-Palestinian, Jews, including Arabs, Muslims, American Christians, if they really want to make a difference, they should have maybe more or give more place to call on the international community to interfere and bring these two groups to the table, because there will be no other solution. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to express your disapproval. It's okay to protest. But the question is, what are you really after? What are you really trying to achieve? And so if you want to achieve the destruction of the state of Israel, I don't know what to say, and I wish you good luck, because it will not happen, and it will not happen this way. If you wish to get rid of Palestinians, you will not achieve it in this way. And so there's only one way, and it's peculiar. There is such insistence on averting the gaze from it. It will have to happen eventually.
Thank you so much, Gil. It's interesting, and I want to get Najwa's take on this. You know, this really large question about where do we go from here. It's a huge question. So I thank you for these contributions. I just one thing you mentioned, Gil, about the peace building and activism and the kind of disillusionment, and it's interesting in terms of protests and counter protests, that these things are kind of being presented monolithically themselves, and that's kind of a problem. Because as you mentioned, in some cases, there are groups that are calling for the annihilation of either, the Palestinians or annihilation of Israel, right? And that, of course, that's not a realistic request on either side. But so on the one hand, distinguishing between a movement and what it's calling for. But on the other hand, like, we can't say that all movements that are in support of these groups can be justified or can be like lumped into agreement with that. Not all pro-Palestine supporters are calling for the destruction of Israel. It's just not the case, right? But what you can see, what you can see in the media, is that if any group is showing up and saying, well, we support Palestine, then automatically it's being assumed that that group supports the destruction of Israel, which is, it's just not the case. But this is an important, I think, call for these groups to be articulate about what they stand for and don't stand for, so that they can't be taken out of context, and then have entire groups labeled. So I want to shift. First, I want to hear Najwa's response, and then I want to kind of start heading towards, what these conversations are looking like on campuses. But Najwa, tell us a little bit about, where do we go from here, and what are some of the challenges, and where are you at this?
Well, I think we all agree on one thing. It's complicated. Nationalism tends to lay exclusive rights. So as it is, it's really difficult to negotiate, especially when the land in question, is smaller than the state of California. On the other hand, I agree with Gil that maybe over the course of the past 20, 30 years, religion has infiltrated the conflict on both sides more and more. And in my opinion, it has, it's bad enough when you argue with nationalists for whom nationalist truths are absolute. And I think with religion, for obvious reason, it's even harder, and you combine the two. There is no time to go into why this happened. For me as a historian, it's very interesting, but it is worthwhile perhaps because I'm also an optimist, and because I don't think we have an option other than to hope, is that there was a time when there were less, let's say, zealots on both sides in terms of at least religion. Even Hamas itself came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had taken the position that even though they dreamed of establishing an Islamic society and so on, that they would not engage in any political action unless that society happened. And they only actually began to be political in the context of the first Intifada. And hard to believe now, the first few months, they were actually nonviolent. Now, Hamas became more and more violent and also much stronger as the Oslo Accords and all the peace that was the hopes for peace that were put in it were dashed. And so Hamas was able to capture Palestinian support on the grounds that the Palestinian secular movement, the PLO and all of that, not only failed at self-determination, but actually compromised too much on those grounds. So what I would say is one thing that might help us historically understand the support for Hamas is that, yes, some people are believers, whether as Islamists or as nationalists, and many are beneficiaries because these groups also provide welfare services. But I think in most cases, people supported Hamas back then as a vote against the secular PLO and its policies, not because it's secular, but because what they viewed as a compromise over peace. And I think we're very familiar with this phenomenon in this country, people voting for one president because they don't want the other. It's very easy to understand. So I would say that, the support for Hamas was flimsy. it actually got watered down as it really misruled Gaza and put Gazans under a lot of jeopardy, including attacking Israel, which of course the price was the Gazans. But what motivated Hamas, rightly or wrongly, is this belief that if Palestinians don't do anything, and this is not about the violence of October 7, but about violence in general, then they will be forgotten. The flip side, the Israeli or Netanyahu believe that only violence will silence, if not eliminate, the Palestinians and provide Israelis with security. I think you have to be inhumane not to believe that both people want peace. Who wouldn't want to open the door and walk to school and not find destruction? And there was a time, not the Oslo Accords, but there was a time when some of us, Israelis and Palestinians, dreamed of one state, a secular state. I don't think this will happen in a long time, but I think it's the only way to have peace is to share. Maybe in a federal system, maybe side by side, whatever in 50 years or 25 years these people imagine. I think at this point, the ill will, the hatred, the violence is so deep. And practically speaking, I mean, there is no Gaza left. And I don't think Hamas will ever be an alternative and should not be representative of the Palestinian people. So I'd say yes, pessimism. But given that we don't have a choice, we have to strive for one, hopefully secular nation state, or just two side by side and learn to share this place.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. So a complicated, difficult path ahead. I want to shift to asking about campuses and, you know, as being part of kind of producing the types of perspectives and the knowledge that'll be necessary to build a future. And I absolutely love what you're saying, Najwa, about, you know, who wouldn't want peace, right? That's the dream, but the work to get there is a very longer process that's going to require, you know, a lot of work. So in terms of campuses, what are they getting right now? What are they getting wrong? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing? How in your assessment, you know, how are these conversations being handled? Where are you seeing some of the big challenges? What do you wish was being done differently? Let's kind of have it open.
Yeah, let me start with that because I literally today was emailing a colleague at USC, and so you look at what happened there. You know, when they first announced a couple of weeks ago the issues around the young woman who's to be their valedictorian and the concerns there, I'm with a group, the LA Institute of Humanities, that meets at USC, and so I emailed folks saying, "Hey, what's happening here?" And then I actually just sort of, not naively, but, you know, emailed their president, Carol Folt, and their provost, Andrew Guzman, and said, "Hey, you don't know who I am. I'm past president of America. I'm a scholar of Islam in America. Can I help you with what's happening here?" Didn't hear anything back, which neither here nor there. But then I spoke with Sherman Jackson, and I say this in complete and utter candidness. I am a scholar of Islam in America. Sherman is the scholar of Islam in America. He has an endowed chair at USC, and he said that USC hadn't been in touch with him either. And I think, oh, that's problematic. Like, you literally have the best scholar of Islam in America as an endowed chair in your faculty, and you don't reach out to them. And so that's, I think, the negative side of things. I don't mean that as siding with factors like that. I'm saying, like, you have this resource, use it, be it, you know, and when you don't use it, then folks are concerned. And so I was emailing a friend of mine who's in their film school, actually, you know, best film school in the country is the USC Film School. And they're concerned that there's been no faculty well, faculty governance is always a complicated thing at private universities, but, you know, that the faculty have been sort of shut out of any of these things, and so that they're voting on no confidence. That there's things happening at UCLA. I've heard that today of a no confidence vote against Chancellor Block and what might happen there. So I think those are bad ways to do it. Now, let me valorize us because, of course, we're the greatest. I think what's happening at LMU, I think, is good in the sense that we are a Catholic Jesuit school. We have a number of students who are Catholic, a number of students who are other kinds of Christian. We have a couple hundred Jewish students. There's an Office of Jewish Student Life. We have a couple hundred Muslim students. There's an Office of Muslim Student Life. We have an Arab Student Association. We have students supporting Israel. We have Students for Justice in Palestine. And so just all the complexities, Jewish students, Muslim students, Palestinian students supporting Israel, Students for Justice in Palestine, Arab students, all those kinds of differences are supported here. The administration, I think, has done the right thing a number of times. And part of that is we can do that at a private school where, at the very beginning of the conflict after October 7th, you saw the sort of kidnapped posters, for the hostages. And there were students that wanted to put them up. Our administration said no, because they knew what would happen if they did. Some folks would tear them down. Some folks would vandalize them. Other folks would say, well, wait a minute. Why are you putting up the posters of the kidnapped hostages and not the posters of the children killed in Gaza? And so I think that way of dealing with it, I think, was really powerful. And we just had our commencement this Saturday, and it was, again, singing the praises of LMU, literally singing. John Legend is our commencement speaker, undergraduate. Janelle Monet is our graduate speaker. And you had, after our provost spoke, after the national anthem, before our president sort of started, you had a number of students that got up with boycott, divest sanctions. There's issues in our student government about should the student government have a BDS resolution, which I think is an interesting one because I don't know the student government has a lot of involvement with Israel. So it's a symbolic thing rather than an actual, kind of thing there. But you had students that for about 30 seconds sort of said that, and the president, to his credit, sort of let it happen and then said, okay, let's stop this. We've got free speech zones set up. Let's deal with the thing. And then John Legend, to his credit, I mean, that guy's extraordinary. He spoke for 40 minutes. Most commencement speakers, 15, 20 minutes canned speech. John Legend spoke for 40 minutes. He said, literally, where Sunken Garden is the place, so you'll see why I'm saying this in a second. Let's name the elephant in the garden, elephant in the garden. Let's talk about Israel, Palestine. Let's talk about these kinds of things. And then, starts going into sort of Paul and love and notions of love, and then singing. And there's nothing like hearing John Legend a cappella sing Stevie Wonder's, Love's in Need of Love Today from Songs that Give Life. And so I think, we're doing things, knock wood, in the right way because you listen to people, you listen to faculty, you support students, you understand that there will be conflict. Our students have protested against the president's office. They've thrown like bloody dolls at the president's door. And again, I say that as someone who happens to be a friend of our president, but it's like, yeah, I don't think Tim's got any involvement in complicity with the, what's happening in Israel. So I don't know that this is directed towards him, but you allow this to happen. You say, okay, you know what? People have the right to freedom of expression. People have the right to peaceful assembly. When it crosses the line into vandalism, when it crosses the line into destructive or any kind of physical aggression, intimidation, that's a different matter. But you got to let the students do those kinds of things because that's how we had the change. I'll stop here because I mentioned before teaching at Cal State Northridge. Cal State Northridge is ground zero for Chicano studies. Why? Because in the 1970s, you had folks occupying the president's office, the dean's office, going, why are we not? Do you understand there's some Chicanos, Latinos here in the San Fernando Valley? Why are we not being addressed? Why are we not being taught our own history? Same way you had Black students, ethnic studies really comes out of that sort of activist ideal there. And I think that's the right way to do it. And I think for it's different for you because we have this extraordinary luxury of having money and facilities. So I understand that with the community college system, budgets are tight. You don't have the support. You don't have the kinds of resources. You don't have the money for food or being able to bring in speakers and have food and have people sit at a table and literally talk to each other. I think those are the kinds of things that we need to do. The kind of trip, and I'll stop here. I said I'd stop here, but I will stop here. The kind of trip that Gil and I did in 2012. The fact that we're able to take our students, to Israel and Palestine to show them on the ground the kinds of things that are happening there. That's where the learning, takes place.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. And I want to hear Najwa and Gil on this question of the campuses, but I just want to put out there, Amir, you're talking about the importance of all these different voices that are taking place on campus. And I think one of the things I'm seeing conflated in the media and even in the way campuses are handling things is in the issue of safety and what that means. Do we mean physical safety or do we mean intellectual safety? And I'm noticing that sometimes safety is saying, oh, I'm safe from being exposed to ideas or voices that I don't want to hear. So if I hear a different perspective, I'm not safe. And that's not the case for a college. That's not the case for higher education. That's not the case for academia. It is important to be exposed to ideas that you may, and voices and even groups that you may disagree with. And that, you know, that type of safety we're not necessarily providing, but you should be able to go to your classes without being, you know, assaulted personally. So I don't know, as you're thinking about campuses, this issue of, you know, sensitivity to exposure versus, you know, threats to personal safety, or generally your takes on, you know, what campuses are getting right or wrong. And whomever wants to take it next, Gil or Najwa.
Okay, I'll take it. I was actually just reading in the English version of Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, and which I find actually much more informative than and fairer, in fact, than most American newspapers for that matter. An interview with a professor, I think, at the University of Rochester, who addressed the very same issue you raised, which is, he says, yes, lots of students complain about, and he is Jewish, about being unsafe, and let's distinguish here. So I agree absolutely that not just students, but everybody should never, ever be attacked, of course, particularly on campuses. I think students should have free access to classes because a lot of them, many of them pay so much money and they should not be deprived of education. A problem, by the way, that is going on in Palestinian universities where people take over and then forget what they're there for. So for this professor, I mean, the argument is if you feel unsafe because you don't like what you're hearing is one thing, but if you're feeling unsafe because you're being attacked is another. And he actually concluded by saying that the only unsafe thing in all of this is Israel in regard to how people feel about it after this war. Now, so I think that it is very exciting that students are being political, that they're participating, that they're being activists. And I would have felt like this no matter what. In fact, I have been waiting. Where have the demonstrations before this were about our own political crisis, about the fact that we are not being represented on issues of pharmaceutical lobbying or guns or reproductive rights? It's just, where are these voices? But I also, as I said, think that maybe the motivation for it was the war, which is quite brutal. On the other hand, it did bring up issues that are of major concern to other ethnic groups, whether Latino or African Americans or Jews or Jewish Americans and so on. So I think it's wonderful, and especially in a place like LMU where it can be done and done with respect and safety. And maybe, and this is where I will stop because I know we're running out of time, is that maybe the next step would be maybe in a year, maybe when the really strong sentiments on both sides begin to diminish, the students and then the public can start conversations about, okay, we have seen what happens when war is allowed to take full force. We know this is not solving anything. It's just killing hundreds, thousands of civilians on both sides. So let's look at things. Now, no American audience is going to solve this, and I am convinced that the United States should not be a party to any peace, because every time it has in the past 50 years, it was a disaster, because you can't be a peace broker and a supporter of Israel. I mean, even little kids know this. But on the other hand, I think that what students are showing is that they have understood that the political is personal. And this should happen at every level and not just with respect to Israel Palestine. So that's my say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Gil.
I agree with Najwa on the issue of the wave of protest that I think many of us faculty members have been waiting for, not just for this kind of acute situation where there's really a need to cry against and to try and impact and stop the war with all of its losses. So there, I also share with Najwa the admiration for campuses that manage to conduct these or contain these demonstrations without vandalism, without attacks. We shouldn't sugarcoat it. There were definitely very, very violent situations. There were definitely attacks. There were definitely events that could have been interpreted by Jews in particular as attack on their religion, on their national identity, and so on. And so I don't think that the fact that the cause is just absolves and justifies every means. And I think that this is partly what many Jews and Israelis were responding to in the first couple of weeks after, or even in the week of October 7th, where it seems to be that even before the bombing of Gaza, a lot of students, a lot of voices in academia from faculty were exhilarated, and they actually used this word because they felt like finally violence is used where it needs to be used, and Israel deserves what it got. And that happened even before Israel retaliated. And so you can't blame those who are somewhat suspicious of the way this movement started. It started very, very early, obviously with frustration about an ongoing situation that's been happening for years. But that was not the reaction that many Jews were expecting at this stage. So I think we shouldn't ignore that. And with all the, and I support everything that both Amir and Najwa were saying about freedom of speech, about freedom of expression, about the need for students to be politically involved. This is something that we're trying to teach them, to be involved citizens. We need to support it. We shouldn't in any way try and limit it. I also think that in many cases, people think that Jews on campus are being spoiled brats by complaining. And in many cases, it is very, very disturbing. So it's not just this kind of attempt to push back against criticism. Sometimes it's really based on what they're experiencing. So that should be said. The other thing that I wanted to say that I think alienates the demonstrations is partly what Najwa was saying. The fact that suddenly, out of all the horror violence, the horrible violence in the world, after all the injustice here in the US, with all the problems that it's facing, with all the aggression, both institutional and personal, against minorities, transgender people being targeted and killed, women's rights are being taken away. In all of this, the students chose to develop this extraordinary movement on something that is happening somewhere else. And so maybe it came to symbolize different things. It came to absorb many of the other problems. And this is an expression of anger and frustration about everything. But that is also why many choose not to join them, even though they think the war needs to stop. the killing is unbearable and would otherwise join these demonstrations. So I would warn against ideology taking over. Ideology often does not see subtlety. And when you begin to develop, I even heard many developing these post-colonial, anti-colonial theories about justifying violence. And sometimes violence, horrible as it may be, is justified. And they are citing Fanon, and they're citing all kinds of writers and thinkers who I think would be horrified to be used in this way. But the ideology, the ideological part, is not making it better. It's not helping. It's very rigid, and it's not allowing for dialogue and for listening. So that's the only thing that I think I would warn against. And the ideological posing as well, which I think Amir was mentioning earlier. There's some level of performance about it, which is fine. It's absolutely fine. But in these kind of very, very tense situations, it's limiting rather than helping. I'll stop here.
That's such a great note to go out on. I absolutely agree, you know, how so much of the conversation can be limiting, especially when people are kind of, the media and social media has people wanting to kind of pick sides as though there are distinct sides without relationships between them that have complex histories and complex futures. It just, you know, it doesn't work like that. And this kind of picking sidesism really is an obstacle to being both able to understand what's happening on our campuses or in Israel and Palestine. It's an obstacle to understanding, but it's also an obstacle towards working towards, you know, peace in a way that works for everybody. So on that note, I want to you know, thank you all for holding a space for complexity today. And that can be hard for people, right? You know, I'm looking at the chat, and someone mentioned, you know, Jewish Voices for Peace, that they don't, this organization they don't approve of. And you know, this is part of the conversation, this part of this complexity. There's a lot of moving pieces. And I want to close on a thought that I've been wrestling with. And I was thinking of the sociologist and theologian Peter Berger. I'm thinking of the heretical imperative and his idea that modernity pluralizes, which, you know, suggests that the contemporary societies are defined by frequent and intense interactions between people who hold different identities. And we've heard so much confirmation of this insight today about these complex pasts that are anything but discrete and disconnected, and how much we need to be able to hold that conceptual space, to be able to hold complexity. And as folks are listening to this talk and all this expertise that you all have brought to the table today, I don't want our audience to think that this work is only for historians, only for scholars of religion, only for experts. And here's why. So I'm a new parent, and you know, my son's background includes Muslims, it includes Catholics, it includes Orthodox Christians, it includes Southern Methodists and Southern Baptists, all within just our family. And like many people in his generation, which some are calling Generation Alpha, I guess that's going to be the new Generation Z. It's looping back around to Generation Alpha. That like many people in his generation, my son is going to grow up in a multilingual, multicultural, multi-faith extended family. So he is going to need the skills that we're talking about today just to get through the holidays, let alone to be able to tackle larger political and social issues. So my point is that everyone needs the ability to navigate diversity, especially ethnic, cultural, religious diversity, in 21st century democracies, not just the experts. And yet we need experts. We need you all. We need us to provide the guidance and the training. But this need for this space of holding multiple truths, I think, is part of a larger civic need that all of us are kind of figuring out that we desperately so need in this moment. And so to my community colleagues in particular, I want to remind us that we have a particular opportunity and responsibility by virtue of the diverse populations that we serve to show that differences are something that can be celebrated rather than feared, and that diversity can be a strength as well as a destructive force. So I want to end with that, and thank you so much, all of you, for your time and energy and expertise today. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you've shared today. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to each of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you all at American River. Again, we started with this. Let's end with this. Thank you all at ARC for your work. It's really extraordinary.
And for all the students and faculty and everybody else who attended, thank you.
That's absolutely. Thank you for inviting us.